Okay. Hi, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who write on human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan, and my co-host Anu is also here. We aim to bring together academics who are working on animals in India. Today we have with us Katie Gillespie, and we're going to discuss her essay, An Unthinkable Politics for Multispecies Flourishing Within and Beyond Colonial Capitalist Ruins. This talk is going to be recorded, but it's a very informal discussion. So feel free to ask a question at any point or put points or questions in the chat box. I thought, Katie, that we could begin by talking about what you think about multi-species flourishing, because I keep seeing that phrase everywhere these days, and I wanted to know how you would define it in very simple terms.
Yeah, thanks. I think, it's definitely a term that's being talked about, I think, more and more frequently. For me, I think it's about sort of animals, allowing animals to, or creating the conditions for non-human animals to have a sort of self-determination in their lives. So thinking about, what do animals need, and not just species, but specific animals within species. What do they need physically in their lives, in terms of, the sort of like physical environment, the kinds of care that are required, especially in domesticated contexts, for instance. With my work is mostly on farmed animals. And so there's, going to be quite close contact between humans and animals in those contexts. And so thinking about what the human can give in terms of care that really creates those conditions for self-determination in their lives, but also thinking about wild animals living sort of freely on their own. There may be a need there for non-contact between humans and animals. So sometimes the best thing we might be able to do is just you know leave them alone, for instance. And so I think depending on both the sort of context of domestication or living freely, the conditions for flourishing are going to look different. I think also there's sort of the physical requirements of care. There's also, I think, an important thing is about the emotional experiences of non-human animals. How can they how can they be supported in terms of the relationships they have, their kind of emotional and cognitive responses to their the conditions under which they live. And I think part of the role there for humans is to try to understand in as non-invasive a way as possible what animals sort of lived, like emotional and kind of cognitive experiences. So there's these different parts, I think, to flourishing. And to me, it's really context based, and it's about both the species and also the individuals, because within a species, individuals are going, just as in a human species, individuals need something totally different often from what someone else needs. So there just has to be this kind of like fine-tuned attentiveness, I think, to like what those conditions are going to look like.
Yeah, I was thinking about and I think this is a point that's raised by others too, about how the sanctuary space allows animals freedoms, but at the same time, they are subject to certain rules and conditions, and so they're not entirely free. But the sanctuary is also very much a space of care. So then, would you say that flourishing is a kind of care, but it's more hands off, so that the animal can do what she wants?
I think so. Yeah, I think I think that as much as possible. I mean, you know, a lot of non-human animals, individuals do really enjoy close contact and interaction with humans. And so, you know, in some cases, it wouldn't necessarily be totally hands off, but also, you know, it would be what kind of interaction or contact does sort of feel good or feel right to individuals of particular species, and sort of being attentive to that in these kind of like uh, like attending to sort of micro responses in how animals are you know, are experiencing that contact. But in, you know, in sanctuary settings are captive spaces. You know, most often animals don't have a choice about whether or not they're there to begin with. And then there's all the things that are sort of interventions in their lives, you know, sterilization, for instance, you know, to prevent reproduction in sanctuary spaces, confinement within, you know, fences or other kinds of structures. There's, I think, in a lot of sanctuaries, prioritizing safety, but that sometimes that safety is, you know, is offered through, you know, greater captivity or bodily control and that kind of thing. And so I think one thing to think about with flourishing, especially, you know, in captive spaces like sanctuaries, would be, you know, what's the balance between safety and freedom, and sort of self-determination, and safety. It's interesting, I've been reading in the human context, I've been doing a lot of sort of research and also some advocacy around human elders and the way that safety in specific, you know, especially like in institutions like assisted living or nursing homes or those kinds of intensive kind of care spaces, that safety often sort of forecloses possibilities for more freedom, and that maybe safety isn't actually the thing that should be prioritized. It's important, but when that becomes the sort of main objective, it does lead to kind of more more bodily control, more sort of limitations. So yeah, I think there's, you know, there are a lot of ethical issues related to you know, related to how much control is exercised in those spaces. And I think that a lot of sanctuaries think about that a lot and try to you know, like revise their you know, their relationships with animals in a way that, you know, tries to alleviate some of those limitations, but there are just some that can't be totally eliminated, especially for domesticated animals, I think.
And I feel like I've read somewhere where you have criticized people like Haraway, who will argue for some cycle of life and death, or where there is some amount of animal suffering. But I feel like her position is certainly different from the position of, you know, deaths happening in sanctuary spaces or people who are working in such projects. But do you think, you know, in a situation like the one that you detailed before, like in a sanctuary where certain decisions have to be taken or certain animals will eventually die, do you think that scenario is different from passively saying animals die? Do you think that difference is a moral claim, where you say that animal lives are important? What do you think is the difference between these two positions?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that, I mean, I think one difference is just the sort of fundamental way that non-human animals are rendered killable, and Haraway talks about that in a particular way. But that that animals are born into the world as killable by humans, and that extends both to domesticated contexts and like wild or free living contexts, that there's just this inherent killability and acceptance of death outside of sort of natural death or end of life processes. And so there's just this fundamental difference in how non-human animals are conceptualized as related to death, and specifically to killing. And in sanctuaries, I mean, I think there's much more frequently death is done through euthanasia, which, I mean, euthanasia has been sort of co-opted as to depoliticize killing in context of farming, for instance. The language of euthanasia comes up there, even though euthanasia is really meant to be about the eliminating the individual's suffering at end of life. And so I think the considerations that people make in sanctuaries around death, and I mean, you could call euthanasia killing also, isn't about the animal being fundamentally killable. It's about attending to their experience, what kinds of bodily suffering and deterioration they're experiencing. And so I think there's just so in the best cases, euthanasia is a kind of gift to give, to the animal. And it's one that, I think, there's, growing, it's increasingly common now for humans to talk about euthanasia in terms of, in the US, one of the ways we talk about it is like death with dignity, when you have a terminal diagnosis and you're close to death, and you can choose physician assisted suicide or that kind of thing. And so that's increasingly common in human contexts, but in animal contexts, because of animals conceptualization, I think because of animals conceptualization as being killable, that kind of almost translates into the conditions where animals can be killed in a compassionate way based on what their experience is, not sort of what humans are going to use them for, as in like farming or other contexts. So yeah, I think there's this sort of like double-edged thing here, where it's animals have, like, because of their position in human society, they can be euthanized more more easily. But yeah, so I think just getting back to the original question, I think there is this sort of like fundamental difference, and it's around killability and what the reasoning is for killing animals that really differs between those contexts. And I think sort of making this blanket statement around death, all animals are going to die, kind of overlooks the really significant differences in those two kind of motivations for killing and experiences of death.
But would the framework, I have two related questions to what you just said. First, in the framework of multi-species flourishing, are there humans involved? Would humans be considered as one of the species? And two, going back to Haraway again, one of the ways she gets out of this obvious problem is by saying that animals and humans are connected, and she uses the relationality to argue that something has to perish, and more often, however sad it is animals. So then what would so does multi-species flourishing, as you think it, does that include humans as well? And second, how would you what would you say to the connectivity or relationality argument?
I think I think one thing, wait, sorry, could you repeat the first question?
Whether multi-species flourishing includes humans as one of the species. And secondly, whether relationality, what would be your counter argument to that?
Yeah, so I think that I mean I think thinking about it, so often human flourishing as relates to animals is it's I mean one of the most obvious examples there is just eating animals. And I know that, Haraway talks about that a lot, and it's a, widely discussed, question around whether or not it's right for humans to eat animals. And I think that, looking at the particular context, for instance, where humans are eating animals, I think there are differences in terms of like, what is flourishing mean for humans? So is it about, is eating animals just about sort of, fulfilling tastes or like the enjoyment of animal-based foods? And, I think leaving aside the sort of situations where people might need to eat animals to survive, I think most people are eating animals as a form of, cultural expression, tradition, taste, enjoyment of animal-based foods. And when weighed against an animal's life, I think, if you're thinking about flourishing, how important is, fulfilling the taste for, animal-based foods with the very fact of, the animal's life and death. That, there, I think thinking about the stakes for both humans and animals can help to define sort of what flourishing means and what are the most important features of flourishing in, a human or animal life. And certainly I think that being able to continue to live is really core to the flourishing of non-human animals. I think sort of the human, desire for eating animal-based foods is sort of, if we're going to do some kind of like hierarchy or ranking of the elements of flourishing, that in my mind would come much lower than the animal's interest in being alive and living their lives and being in relationship. And I think that, I think one of the things about being, inherently killable, and I think that this sort of like relationality argument, that there's a sort of like, natural or naturalized kind of hierarchy where, humans eat animals and, animals don't typically eat humans. There's this kind of fundamental power imbalance that I think is really rooted in, such an anthropocentric orientation um, to humans. And certainly there's a, hierarchy within humans of sort of who gets to, define the conditions for others. But there's this fundamental sort of human exceptionalism, human supremacism that emerges in framing animals as sort of killable in this like relational web um, of living and dying. I don't know if that answers your question. That's something I've been kind of trying to work out myself.
Anu, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Susan. Katie, I have again a question and a request, and I'll start with the request first. Would you maybe speak to us a little about how you use the term colonial capitalist ruins? How is one to understand this concept of the ruins? Is it the process of ruination, or is there more to it? And then the second is the question. I mean, this was also a question actually, because in your article you reject the notion of the small scale family farm as the more ethical alternative to industrial scale animal farming. And you also take a stand against, let's say, what are called more humane raising and slaughtering practices, or the idea of free range poultry, or eggs produced from free range birds. Um, and I am reading this in connection with the idea of systemic violence, for example, as something which can be understood as the catastrophic effects or results of certain economic and political systems. And this violence is so normalized that it is not even seen, it is not even visible as violence in itself anymore, but rather it is deemed as the normal, non-violent, zero level standard against which we then start measuring the violence of other sort of acts where, for example, a clear perpetrator is visible or identifiable. Um, how can one make the violence of, and in this case, it is the colonial capitalist system of animal farming, how can one make this violence, which is so embedded in the very practice, regardless of how the animals are treated with greater or lesser levels of cruelty or whatever, um, how does one make it visible that the practice in itself is violent?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, because it is so embedded and sort of this colonial capitalist system, and agriculture specifically is such a deeply rooted hegemonic structure, or like, I mean, I'm really thinking about it as an ongoing process of colonization and of transforming and sustaining life as fundamentally capital. Maybe an anecdote would be helpful. I recently moved last year from Seattle, where I lived for 20 years, and this large city, to this super rural town in north central Washington state in the US that is we have like 18 year-round residents. A lot of people come up just for vacation, to hunt, but those kinds of things, but it's a very small town. And I'd always most of the research that I had done for, on agriculture in the past was larger scale farming, or small scale farming, where there's much more sort of intensive captivity, like a, distinct kind of farm context. It's captive. There are fences containing people, and there's all this intervention into animal lives. But when I got up here, I was driving through this forest nearby, one of the first times I visited here, and there were just cows loose in the woods. And then I started to notice that cows were really all over the place, not necessarily confined by fences. They have, in the woods, they have these cattle guards on the road that prevent animals from passing through, to go to other areas. But it's really sort of the, I guess, epitome of like free range farming. And so the process is that during the winter, the cows are kept in down in the valley here, in more captive farm settings. But then for the summer, they're trucked up to the woods, let go. They're bred every year so that the calves are born on the farm in the spring, and then are pretty quickly all dumped together out in the woods. And I was really sort of trying to reckon with what this means, because seeing the cows in the woods, without any contact with humans to speak of for, many months of the year, it does seem, I thought, oh, this could be what cow flourishing could look like, right? Living sort of lives in that moment of self-determination. They can move freely as they want. They're in community with their offspring, and also other members of the herd. It's not this sort of separation or alienation of, as in dairy, like a mother cow having her calf removed quickly in service to the extraction of milk as a commodity. And so I sort of was like getting lulled into this, like, oh, this is so much better. And then I just started learning more about the process, and fundamentally, it's the same in terms of the sort of intervention of humans into the reproductive capacities of animals. There's this breeding. All the calves are born, at the same time. This is cows raised for beef. So the calves live longer. They're left with the herd and with their mothers for, a couple of years. So they grow up together, moving between, free ranging, mostly on public lands, but also private land, because it's the whole area is categorized as rangeland. They are allowed to go anywhere. So if a private property owner doesn't want cows ranging on their land, they're responsible for fencing them out, which I think is an interesting, sort of designation around how land is conceptualized and how the state itself supports that. And then yes, so anyway, sorry, I'm down a rabbit hole here, but but so the calves will stay with the herds for a couple of years, which in some ways seems so much better than having the calves removed. But then reading about some of the like ethological research on cows and their deep emotional and relational connections to each other, to a mother and their calf or young, that the longer they're together, the more intense that bond becomes. And so thinking about the sort of stakes for, yes, there's this sort of like a little bit more freedom in their lives, but is this might this even be more traumatizing for animals, for cows in particular, to go through this kind of life than it would be in more confined settings. So I think, and then of course the end point is the same. Cows are used for reproduction. The calves go to slaughter. So there's these sort of fundamental similarities, I think, between small scale or free range farming, which just ultimately at the end of the day conceptualize animals as capital, and that's so closely tied to well, certainly to like capitalist relations, and cows are sort of seen as the earliest form of capital, and so that's such a deeply rooted sort of structure and process that not only affects humans and ecosystems and all of that, but really just drives the sort of fundamental positioning of animals in these structures. And I think in terms of the colonial capitalists, I would love to hear your all thoughts on the sort of post-colonial context in India and South Asia, because this sort of settler colonial context here in the US and North America, Australia, is a particular kind of process, and farmed animals have been used both as as colonial subjects themselves, but also kind of colonizing settler subjects, and that certainly feels so visible here in the American West. That's where settlers expanded to. It was the creation of the railroad really did so much damage. I mean, on this sort of this question of ruination, I think there are these fundamental moments in time, like the creation. I've been thinking a lot about the creation of the railroad system in the US, but it's just sort of fundamentally founded on destruction of ecosystems, a process of ruination, of destroying wild animal habitats and lifeways, indigenous human communities, and so there's this process of ruination that I think is driven by specific events, but also ongoing processes like agriculture, but alongside the sort of like active process of ruination, what it creates, is a ruins. And so I think we can see that, like, in the land, in the destruction of, there's a lot of like clear cutting forests, that it's all about, one, using wood, for instance, as a commodity, but also just, creating more rangeland, all of that. And so I think, like, I've been thinking about apocalypse and, like living in this sort of like apocalyptic world where increasingly like every space is affected by this like colonial capitalist ruination. And then what are we left with, and who are we left with? And but also, what if the apocalypse has already happened? What if the apocalypse has actually colonial capitalism and its ongoing, just ongoing ruination of really the planet, and that we're living in the sort of like the ruins of that apocalypse. I think there's always this feeling that like, oh, something is going to happen to just like completely, wipe out life as we know it, and that's the apocalypse. But I don't know, I've just been thinking about like, what if the apocalypse has happened and this is the state of ruin we're in. I don't know if that answers those questions, but
Yes, it does. Thank you. That was very interesting. Um, and connects to actually a couple of other things that I had been thinking about. Maybe I'll come back to them in a bit. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, this question is so, I feel like it's so messed up in the post-colonial context because, uh, first of all, the cow is so symbolically but also in reality connected to the life of the farmer, and that really defines agriculture. And um, it's not easy also to talk about sanctuary space in the same way because of lack of space. Um, and uh, but and the issue is doubly complicated when we try to situate these problems in the global context, because and I want to know if the same argument you think applies, which is that in when we're talking about environment or forests and climate change, one of the early environmental position that India has taken is that we have to have differential responsibilities, because it's, as a post-colonial state, India should be allowed to grow. And there seems to be some distinction made between the nation's flourishing and environment as resources and so on. And you address this in the essay as well, the fundamental mistake of capital, but also animals as property. But since nation states can control the lives of animals, uh, would you say that sanctuary spaces are not possible or less possible in post-colonial spaces?
that's an interesting question, and I would love to hear your thoughts actually on that particular question. I think the issue you bring up about space is an interesting one too. One of the things that happens in in sanctuaries, I think everywhere, I think it's sort of a fundamental difficulty related to sanctuaries. And I know Yamini Narayanan, I imagine you know her work. She's written about sanctuaries in India, and has been doing some ongoing research on those spaces. And one of the things we've talked about is the way that that some of those spaces in India, as well as places in the US, really struggle with space, in the sense that there are so many animals that are in these situations of need and sort of requirements for better care, that it's so easy to sort of bring too many animals in a way that compromises flourishing. And so there's almost this kind of like individual, like not hierarchy, I guess, but like, it's sort of, in some ways, individual lives in sanctuaries become, symbolic of the possibility of transforming life for so many more. So there's some conversation around farm sanctuary in the US talks about like individual animals as ambassadors for their species, and just sort of representations of what life could could look like. And so just on that trait, you're mentioning the sort of issue of around space and the and growth. That's one thing, I've been thinking about a lot, is just the limitations there. I think in terms of, I'm really kind of less familiar with the post-colonial context. I mean, I've read a lot of work on in Indian animal studies around around the cow and the just like fundamental importance of religious, cultural, political, certainly role of the cow, which I think really complicates the question of what flourishing means, and how the cow's individual life gets sort of articulates with these really complex, like, cultural, political projects. And I was trying to think about a similar example, in, for instance, the North American context, and I can't think of one that is so fraught and makes and sort of gets at just these really intense political projects around exclusion, violence against humans, and I think I think that's a really interesting example that pushes this in different directions. I'm not giving any kind of satisfying answer here, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because it's something I would like to learn more about and think more about outside, in context outside of the sort of settler colonial structures.
Well, what I struggle with is that, it's also really closely connected to the question of livelihood. And especially if you're doing work with these animals among people who are using them, then it's very difficult to make a case for these animals to them, because it looks like, hold on. Because it looks like they really need these animals, and they're part of a framework that really it's sometimes, it passes through generations, but it just doesn't feel like we have the moral authority then to say to their face that, even to make a case for a sanctuary for animals, or that the animals should be free. And I feel like that is a tricky position, and that's particularly a problem that is post-colonial, because because animal husbandry is such a major part of the Indian economy, and it's closely connected to agriculture. So it's agriculture and animal husbandry, and they're both also interrelated. So it really does seem like it's an unthinkable politics, as you put it in the essay. And I was thinking that if there are differences between, between the US and India, but there are obviously lots of differences when it comes to the lives of animals. But it seems like the sanctuary or the logic that goes into the sanctuary is what we will arrive at as a sort of ideal position, because that's the one space where animals can be free and can flourish. So I was, what I felt while reading your essay was also a fear that, would it imply then that the flourishing of animals would be more possible in spaces in the US than in post-colonial spaces? Would you think that's where the logical conclusion would be?
I mean, yeah, possibly. I mean, the livelihood, I think that I totally agree that that's an unthinkable politics. I don't, it's an issue that comes up, I think one of the things that comes up in terms of, arguing for the sort of extrication of animals from livelihoods, is like, this sort of, it could, well, farmers could transition to other kinds of farming. And I think that sometimes gets to be this sort of blanket statement that doesn't take into consideration, the nature of the land, and space that people have, the kinds of skills that or knowledge that are required for different kinds of farming. There's an organization in the US, and oh gosh, now I can't remember what it's called, but that helps farmers transition away from animal farming, helps to sort of get them the knowledge and also resources they need to transition. And I think that that's sort of a hopeful, it's a hopeful kind of exercise or movement, but I don't know how realistic it is on a broader scale, especially in a context like India, where livelihood is such a central factor in farming animals. I mean, there's in the US, farming, especially dairy, it's very hard to actually make a living. Farmers are in indebted in trying to expand their farms. The price of milk, for instance, is so low that there's really no profit there. And so, I'm not sure if that sort of if that is the same in India, but it's just it's a difficult way to make a livelihood unless or a living unless you're much larger scale. And there was also an interesting, I guess it was in 2018, the hurricane that hit the east coast of, thinking it was Hurricane Florence, but I may not be right on that, hit the east coast of the US, and it specifically affected the North Carolina's hog farming, and also chicken and turkey farming, where there's this massive flooding. Farmers didn't, they're growing, raising animals in these like intensive conditions in these large CAFOs, sheds, and rather than trying to evacuate the animals, they locked the sheds and left, and then there was so many animals drowned and died as a result. And but this was an ongoing problem of really related to climate change and the climate crisis, that flooding and these catastrophic storms hitting that region were making it even more difficult for farmers to make a living, to raise animals. And I think this is probably relevant in a lot of different global contexts as climate change escalates and makes places more vulnerable to that kind of destruction. But what happened in the wake of that was that the state actually recognized this ongoing problem, and created a program. I don't know if it's still ongoing or if it was just sort of like this disaster response program, but where they offered to buy out farmers, who were raising animals, to then transition into other kinds of farming and move to other spaces that would be less vulnerable to all of this sort of ruination as a result of the changing climate. So I think there are some specific examples of like where, just in general, my mind goes to the sort of like, what does the transition look like? It can't be a cutting out of animals, in agriculture because it is such a core, um, you know, core need for humans' livelihoods. But sort of what's going to be replaced there, and how can the state, I think the two examples I gave were like, this was coming from, on one hand, an NGO that is trying to sort of just offer that option, and then also like, what is the role of the state in that? And of course, the state in the North Carolina context was not about considering the experience of the animals and like that we should transition away from farming them. It was much more about livelihood and the possibility of profit and capital accumulation as a result of farming animals. But I think maybe like the piece that needs to be there is the, like, what's the transition? What is going to fill in the this livelihood question? It can't just be a sort of removal of animals from the picture. It has to consider, like, what are other forms of livelihood are there possible, so that it doesn't then make human farmers even more vulnerable when there's already such struggle in terms of subsistence and survival and all of that.
Yeah, at one point in the essay, you talk about small-scale agriculture and how that kind of replicates the same model without much change, and it causes animals the same kinds of harm. But I noticed that at the end of the essay, you do say that you don't address different kinds of agriculture, like pastoral or nomadic. But I was thinking, would homesteads be a kind of small scale agriculture? Because it is much more small scale than, say, a small scale industrial animal farm, but at the same time they do skin rabbits or eat chickens, and it's the same kind of cruelty. But then I was thinking about how you say that uh, colonial epistemologies have also wiped out indigenous ways of relating. And I'm wondering if homesteads provide some similar kind of intimacy with the animal body and being that can perhaps be anti-colonial in some way.
Yeah, I think maybe one question to ask there is like, who is doing the farming or the homesteading? Like, what is it rooted in? I'm much less equipped to comment on like indigenous ways of raising animals or relating to animals, because I'm just not as familiar with that context. But fundamentally, I think there is a much different sort of orientation to what kinds of relationships are possible, how how humans versus animals are like conceptualized in a like less hierarchical, more sort of like kind of web of life. But I think on the I guess I have two examples from where I'm living now, and both are oriented in white settler homesteading. Just directly next door to me, there's a sheep farm, and the woman who lives there raises about 20 sheep for wool. And it's definitely a sort of mean, I don't think it's not the only or primary way that she makes a living, but it is part of sort of a, kind of eking out a survival here. But she doesn't, the care of the sheep is she doesn't feed them consistently through the winter. And, we have really very cold, harsh winters here. And last winter, the sheep, like one by one, starved to death. And they, I mean, they're not all of them, but probably 4 or 5. And, so and then there's a person down the road a ways who just raises rabbits in cages for meat, and really loves the rabbit, loves her rabbits, has individual relationships with, with each one. They have names, but there's this kind of distance, this sort of necessary distance between the humans in these cases, and the animals, because at a certain point they have to be made killable, or in the sheep's cases, like this is probably not a word, but like neglectable. Oh, maybe that is a word, neglectable. And and so there's like, even as they might feel these deeper connections to the animals, there's like a point where that's just like, there's a fundamental limitation there in, once the animal becomes killable, or seen as sort of not needing basic care even. I mean, the woman next door talks about loving her sheep. And so I think maybe thinking about one, like who's doing the homesteading, how are they positioned within these kind of colonial or capitalist context, and what's the history of that homesteading. I mean, certainly homesteading here is related to the settler colonial project as a way of like occupying space and displacing those who were here before, and then sort of replicating these these relationships with animals that render them capital and colonial subjects, but also just the sort of like, where are the limitations with that sense of relationality with animals, where's the sort of like end point for really kind of centering their lives and experience, and the like feelings of love and connection that people might have with the animals that they raise.
Yeah, it also seems to me that what really distinguishes all these different scenarios is what happens to the animal in the end, whether the animal gets to live or not, whether the animal is subject to violence. And I suppose for the animal, that really does set the tone for her life and decides the meaningfulness and flourishing of her life. But I wanted to know what you think about human agency in all this, because yes, capital and colonialism does set the frame and structurally determines so much. But then where do you think the room for maneuver comes in? I was thinking about horses, and it's a lot of people sell horses when they get old, but some people do keep them, and they say, even if it's really hard, or they say that they just can't give up their horse. So then it is possible for people to stand up to these structures. But do you think that's just individuals and how people are, or do you think there's something else going on there?
I think it's definitely possible to stand up to these structures and think about different ways of, I mean, thinking about sort of like anti-colonial action, for instance. One of the sanctuaries, Vine, that I mentioned in the paper, I think they're really trying to make an effort to think through what what a decolonial or anti-colonial politics might look like in the sanctuary setting, given the sort of complexity of like farmed animals history and agriculture and the like creation of farm space. And so they're trying to, you know, create spaces of flourishing for wild animals, planting, plants for pollinators, preserving certain spaces for that kind of, just sort of hands off as much as possible, like lack of human intervention there. I think there's, oh gosh, there was something else that question sparked. I think one of the things I've been trying to think through is like in terms of the like white settler subject and our relation, like that relationship to the land, to being non-indigenous to like this particular context. Like what does it mean to have a deeper connection to the land itself and to animals, because sort of looking back in history, like because it's such a fundamental way of relating to animals in this sort of like colonial capitalist kind of infrastructure, there's a sort of like Collard and Dempsey and Sundberg talk about looking to the past. And so I think in terms of like anti-colonial action, it's sort of like, what is the pre-colonial set of relations look like? But is there even for this particular kind of subjectivity, and homesteading and all of that, like what is the pre-colonial subjectivity, like what does that even look like? Because in contexts of communities who are indigenous to North America, for instance, there is a sort of past set of relations that can be foregrounded and I think also supported by non-indigenous people. But what is, what I'm, one of the things I'm trying to think there is like, what does that look like, both generally and in sort of specific, like individual contexts where people can resist those relations and where the sort of like settler human subject could be annihilated, not the people themselves, but just that sort of sense of subjectivity. And I think like there's a real yearning among people to like have a greater connection to to the land, to animals. And so thinking through what that might look like outside of this, like these contexts of exploitation. I mean, it's a really creative and like world making project, but I think it's also just so hard to imagine what would look like because of how entrenched like these systems are as norms.
Go ahead, Amy.
Thank you, Susan. Katie, I'm just thinking about the really important point that you make in your article about how knowledge of species must be combined with knowledge of individual animals as well. And I find that very often uh, human efforts to ameliorate the conditions in which animals, whether farmed or others, live, are tainted by the fact that they fall short on at least one of these counts, so that one has an idea of what pigs are like or what sheep are like, etc., and how spaces for them to live in should be designed. And we find that a whole lot of anthropocentric ideas about how a particular species should be kept creep in, and they totally ignore the fact that individual animals might not conform to those sort of notions that we have of what a particular species should be like. As you also show in the case of Libby and Louis, where they've got their own ideas about how they want to live. And I found it marvelous that the two sanctuaries that you've listed, that you've talked about, were open to the idea of revisiting their own conceptions and their own ideas of how sanctuaries were to be designed. So that they started out with what they thought would be appropriate for pigs. And then they saw that the pigs had other plans and they went along with those. So I'm guessing, I mean, not guessing, but I'm pretty sure that this sort of attention to individual animals is obviously only possible in a sanctuary. It is obviously not possible in the farming of animals, especially at a larger scale at all. And the other point that you made about how flourishing equally possible in sanctuary spaces, but not in the farms where the animals are in their death world, so to speak, and bringing them into a life world in the sanctuary would involve that they have the right to self-determination and that this right is acknowledged and respected. And we find that in the case of the two sanctuaries you mentioned, this step does take place, even if the people running the sanctuaries did not come equipped with this realization, they acquired it. And I'm just thinking about how whether these two sanctuaries are somehow an exception in the sense that they managed to develop a more multi-species sort of a sense of space guided by the animals that they were working with, or if this is something that you have noticed in other sanctuaries as well. Whether this is a feature that I would say sets apart the sanctuary from something like a shelter, which works on a whole different set of notions of what needs to be done, where individual animals and their agency is usually not acknowledged, not respected. Is this something that you found as, as an inherent feature of what it is to be a sanctuary? Or would you say that these two were exceptions?
I think to a large extent they're exceptions. I have, I've been to a lot of sanctuaries and for farmed animals or formerly farmed animals. And I think for a lot of them, it's very hard to get outside of the sort of thinking about farmed animals in the sort of context of what it looks like in farming. So like one example would just be like species segregation, for instance, that, many sanctuaries think that like, animals should be should be just with their own species. They don't necessarily think about the possibilities for like interspecies friendships and relationships and love and care and all of that. I one sanctuary I was looking at specifically related to how they housed their pigs was that not only were the pigs separated out from the cows and chickens and other species, but the small pigs, like pot-bellied pigs, were separated out from the large farm pigs. And the rationale was that they would that the big pigs could harm the pot-bellied pigs and all of that. And so again, like this kind of prioritization of safety over considerations of like what kind of relationships animals might like to have, even if that maybe creates some risk. And so I think that I think this actually gets back to sort of the question of like anti-colonial action as well, is like how can we undo those kinds of really deeply ingrained, like normalized way of thinking about these particular species that are just so long-standing, so deeply rooted that it's hard to understand, like hard to even think or imagine what it might look like. And so I think the sort of exception of places like Pig's Peace and Vine is that the individual humans running these places are just on a personal level, like they're incredibly humble people. They like come again and again to the to the space and to these relationships with animals with an open mind, and also like a desire to be changed by animals, to sort of like open themselves up to undoing their own kind of preconceived and deeply rooted sort of like colonial and capitalist kind of not motivations, but sort of ways of relating that are hard to get out of. And so I think in a lot of ways it's about the individual, like it has a lot to do with the individuals and how how open-minded they are, how much they are dedicated to the project of not just caring for animals, but allowing animals to care for themselves. Yeah, and I think too, it's not surprising that both like the folks at Vine and Judy Woods at Pig's Peace are sought after as guides in what sanctuary spaces could be like, and what those human animal relations and intra and interspecies relationships could look like. And the knowledge of the individuals at both of those sanctuaries were largely built through the animals themselves, and not through external like norms around veterinary care and all of that. Veterinary care, especially at Pig's Peace, has been formulated over decades with veterinarians, where Judy actually, based on what she observes with animals, helps to kind of craft new practices of even like what veterinary care looks like. So I think there's a real exciting possibility there for sanctuaries like that are currently the exception to kind of guide a new norm in terms of undoing those kinds of relations, fundamentally kind of hierarchized or limiting kind of relationships.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of this table talk. Thanks a lot, Katie, for spending
Thank
more
you.
than 1 hour with us. It was really great and very interesting to hear your responses. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much. Bye.